Hi, everyone. Delighted to be here. Delighted to be here with you, Gayatri. Okay, I'm gonna read so I stay on point. And actually, well, first I'm gonna do some thanks and a little preamble, and then I'm just gonna talk about one piece, which is human measure, which is the piece that is informing all the works in the show. And rather than I'll do like a little synopsis of the works in the show for those of you who hasn't seen it, and then we'll go into a conversation. Okay, so first,
Maybe I did that. Sorry.
first I want to thank Brandy Keoba for working so hard and so long alongside me with this exhibition. We've been at this for over 4 years. And I also want to thank Matthew Contos, the Director of Creativity and Learning, for putting together just really thoughtful and exceptional programming like the Abolitionist Library that's outside, like the workshop that we're going to have tomorrow. Y'all should come to this workshop with Genevieve and Willa. It's going to be truly transformative and beautiful, and it's wonderful that we can make this offering. I've really felt a lot of care working with the team at the site, and so I really want to just take a moment to thank this incredible install crew. You know, the sense of camaraderie that I have on some of these large-scale performances and the kind of ethos and ethics and just like wholeheartedness that people bring to the work was really, represented again here at site. Like I really felt that family, that camaraderie here. So I just want to thank you all so much. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have this exhibition. But before we start today, I just want to speak to the, all of us really, but specifically the trans community here in the room. Many of you are here today, and I want to say, first and foremost, that I'm just so sorry. Many people are deeply terrified and in so much pain, and these feelings are, of course, very justified. Not only are we dealing with an impending sense of significant bodily and material harm, but our lives and our bodies have been weaponized in this last election, and we continue to be situated as theoretical concepts in this post-mortem of the election. But I also want to say that I wake up every day like incredibly grateful to be trans. And I really believe in the trans and queer community, and I know that we will continue to do what we can collectively to resist in these uncertain and scary times. So I'll start. So as you know, my name is Cassils, and I guess if I were to describe like what I do, I would say that I am a disciplinary slut, or put more politely, let me reframe, I'm disciplinarily promiscuous. I'm an artist working in performance, in film, in sound, in sculpture, and photography. And for me, performance is really a form of social sculpture, drawing on the idea that bodies are formed in relationship to forces of power and societal expectation. My work investigates historical contexts to examine the present moment. I am trans in a moment. I'm a trans artist in this moment where I'm making my body both the material and the protagonist of my performances. And my work really contemplates the histories of LGBTQI violence, representation, struggle, and survival, and ultimately strives to create models for community of care and empowerment and liberation. Today I'm going to focus this talk on a new work. It's a current work for this show, which is titled Movements. Movements is not only physical, but also we can think of movement as a musical score. Movements reverberate socially, politically, psychologically. There's technological movements as well. This exhibition interrogates the act of recording and preserving performance, questioning how the body is framed, how it's mediated, and ultimately reinterpreted. Through cinematic approaches, whether it's the motion of the frame or the stylistic choices that shape it, Movements examines how formal decisions affect our understanding of trans subjectivity. Oh, sorry, I was going to show the trailer, but I'll show it, just in case. So in this show, each movement occupies a single gallery and explores a world. All three movements transpose the live choreography of my dance piece, Human Measure, which was made in 2022, and reconceives this performance as 3 immersive installations that are distinct yet interconnected. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Human Measure, which is this piece of dance that I'm talking about, which has subsequently influenced all the works that you'll see in this show. This piece was initially created in 2016, and it's my first piece working with contemporary dancers. It's rooted in my knowledge of kinesiology, martial arts, sports science, and photography. And I was playing with, I don't really care if everybody knows this, but just so y'all know what I was thinking about, I was thinking about reinterpreting Yves Klein's anthropometry paintings from the 1960s. And I'm sure, do you all know who Yves Klein is? Yes, some no, just for those who don't. He was a French painter in the 1960s and earlier, of course, but he's well known for developing this like incredible color blue called International Yves Klein blue. And he did a sort of cheeky take on the nude. Rather than paint a depiction of a woman naked, he would have women kind of paint themselves with his International Yves Klein blue and then kind of potato press themselves against canvases, and voila, his nudes. Which, you know, by today's standards is kind of misogynist, kind of reducing a woman to a brushstroke and a formal device. But if you dig deeper into Klein, like the work gets weirder, right? And actually more interesting. So you can see in the corner of that top right corner, you see like a symphony. He had accompanying this painting process, there would be a symphony that played a string rendition of the key of D major, playing nonstop for 20 minutes. And of course, when a classical musician attempts to hold a note for that long, it accidentally ebbs, right? And so the D major chord is the sound of tada, like ba-ba, like hope, utopia, the future, but ebbing into a minor, right? So about striving and possibility and then ultimate failure and then striving again is what this score does. So that was interesting. And then as I started to learn more about him, I found out that actually he was a martial artist. And not only was he a martial artist, he had traveled to Japan in 1958 and had a second-degree black belt dan in judo and had studied himself with the founding fathers of judo and created the first Roman language book called Les Fondements de Judo, which is a book that showed, it wasn't an art book, it's a book that shows the katas, which are the basic forms and principles of judo. And so I started to think about those impressions in the mat and my own life as being a personal trainer and pulling a sweaty client off a generic blue gym mat and finding like an etch of their body, of their, you know, their like shoulder blades and their hair follicles and sweat and thinking like, oh, we made a Klein, you know? But, you know, as we move into this moment, and, you know, I just updated this presentation yesterday, 665 bills. 2 months ago, it was 442 bills in 41 states. So this is the legislation tracker that's showing where we're at, really, with over 665 bills sitting on state legislatures in over 43 states, right? And so I started to really think, you know, what does it mean to represent, you know, trans subjectivities in a moment of heightened violence? And what does it mean to grapple with representation when cultural presence does not equate systemic power? And really, like, this question that I ask myself and that I ask my young dancers and those in the trans community that I work with and collaborate with is, how do we hold on to pleasure and power and sensuality and sexuality and presence in your society when it's actively trying to disappear you? There's a collection of essays published by MIT Press called Trapdoors that grapples with these very contradictions. It posits trans people and says that they are frequently offered up as doors, entrances to visibility and recognition, and these are in fact traps, accommodating trans bodies and communities only insofar that they cooperate with dominant norms. And the volume also speculates about a third term, which is perhaps uniquely suited for our time. It's the concept of a trapdoor, neither an entrance or an exit, but perhaps a secret passageway leading elsewhere. But against this currently oppressive backdrop, I started to wonder, what instead of creating a metaphoric and symbolic artwork, I could make a work that through the process of learning and collaborating would serve those involved far beyond the moment when the curtain dropped. And so I decided to tap in to my understandings of mixed martial arts, boxing, and physical training that I'd done. But rather than appropriate judo, as Klein had done, I drew inspiration from self-defense and personal training, personal safety movements. I worked with an incredible choreographer who did all the choreography for the movements that you will see in all of the 3 pieces, named Jasmine Albuquerque. And we housed personal safety workshops for our trans and non-binary dancers, because personal safety workshops are technically given to men and women, and they're based on what they teach you is based on the statistics for attack. Men are attacked for very different reasons than women, and there had never been such a workshop done for trans or non-binary people because that data is not available to us. And so in holding these workshops with these young dancers, we discussed, what has happened to us? What do we wish we'd been prepared for? Or, what would we like to be prepared for in the future? And these kinds of scenarios became the templates for the movements that you see present in the dances. And the other thing that the movement and the choreography holds is really this idea of trying to hold that sort of emotional package of like the bag that has within it both the erasure and the dismissal and the power and the beauty, right? So those two terms. I worked with a really incredible crew of dancers. This is Alucard Mendoza, and for the goths in the room, that's Dracula spelled backwards. Jamarli, Jazlyn, Beat Goss, Cadence Del Mar, Kanyan Calbosa. And in addition to having, the works tour, every place that Human Measure, the dance piece, toured, we also had workshops that we would hold for the community, much like the one we're going to have tomorrow. But in every city, there's so many beautiful practitioners. So to find trans and queer practitioners that hold these embodied knowledges and to share that with the community. So these are open and free workshops to anybody who identifies as such. And this is one that we did called Glitch in the Horizon with Yunoen Ri, who is a non-binary internal martial artist who practices the art of Bagwajan. And we had over 50 folks show up for that. And it was really beautiful. So please come tomorrow and experience one for yourself. And so this is, so that's external programming, that's kind of emotional chords and historical background. Now let's get to the formal aspect. So for Human Measure, I transformed the theater into an analog photographic darkroom. The entire theater is only lit by red safety lights. So I was thinking about trying to create an ambiance that connoted like sirens, blood, red light districts, but also referenced the history of photography. And what you don't really know as a viewer when you're watching this is that the stage is set with a large piece, a 20 by 20 foot piece of muslin, which is treated with cyanotype solution. And during the performances, when bodies slam against the floor, there are blasts of light that expose traces of the performing bodies when we're effectively making a sort of live photogram. And each mark on the canvas on the floor is an indexical record of the choreography that you see before you, frozen in place by this photographic blast. And the other thing that this work does is it, because your eyes are so dilated, much like some of my earlier works like Becoming an Image, when you experience this photographic blast, it creates a retinal burn in your eyes. So the piece gives you either way too little light or way too much light. And I gelled the flash light orange so that it would create a Yves Klein blue after image that would hover in your mind's eye. And that's something that you can't see in the document, and I'll get to that in a second. But these are just to give you a sense of the choreography, just some of the movements that are doing that sort of undulation in tone. And that's kind of like moments where the bodies are prone and the ways that they're exposed into the cyanotypes. But actually, we can't actually make those exposures in real time in Human Measure because you actually need 25 minutes of UV light to create an exposure. So I ended up making these props. These images are from like right after COVID, when we could take our mask mandate, the mask mandates were lifted, first round of vaccinations. 25 trans and non-binary people semi-clad in a parking lot in Los Angeles, holding positions and postures as a sort of prop to make this like floor for the theatrical production. But I realized very quickly in making this was a unique and quite special experience for folks to be lying naked, tenderly, quietly for this 25-minute exposure. And so I actually then later opened that up into a performance of its own right. So this is just an example of the image being exposed, and this is what it looks like after the fact. Excuse me. And so what you end up with is, at the end of the performance, we detach the flooring and we push it into the actual this like infinity pool that we've 20 by 3 foot infinity pool that we've dropped into the theater floor. And this development tray effectively We wash for 20 minutes the actual cyanotype, and then we hoist it up over the audience. So instead of a curtain dropping, we lift up this canvas, which is this incredible sort of representation of everything that you just saw. And I'm really thinking about how these outlines lean into abstraction, and also nodding back to Yves Klein, but are equally suggestive of outlines from, so there's like a Klein and there's our work, but also equally suggested of like the very first representations of humanity, of Pompeii body casts, the remains of over 1,000 victims of 79 AD. These are traces of lives lived. These are our ancestors. Thinking about the chalk outlines, indexing the protesting bodies for those fighting for ACT UP or at Black Lives Matter protests. And then finally also thinking about the shadow burns of victims caught in atomic blasts in Hiroshima. But for me, this question remained, like, how do I transmit viscerality, ephemerality, and intensity of live performances from something like Human Measure into something that lasted? So the live performance took away the ability to view and gaze upon the trans body, but the camera, on the other hand, it renders the body way too faithfully. It renders it legible and crisp, and the bodies that were barely perceptible in the low light of the theater, I now needed to think of a strategy as to how to redeploy abstraction. And so this is really what I attempt to do in the exhibition that I hope you see if you haven't seen it already, titled Movement. So when you first enter the exhibition, you discover Movement 1, and this installation deploys similar tactics to this photograph that you see here, which is the film documents the dance, and it is projected above a reflecting pool of water. And this formal approach is best exemplified by a series of photographic works I made called Human Measure Rorschachs, which consists of performance documentations that have been folded in on themselves, creating sort of abstractions of entangled limbs. Rorschachs are psychological exams that prompts interpretation of the abstract symmetrical ink blot to reveal the viewer's unconscious thoughts, motives, and desires. So I use it here to indicate society's projection on trans bodies. There is a reflecting pool of water in the installation that's also reflective of the development tray that you see in the live performance. And audible throughout the gallery space is the monotone symphony that, instead of being performed by string instruments, is sung by 17 trans and non-binary vocalists that are actually singing each key of the D major octave, so the lowest one to the highest D major, which was sung by our mezzo-soprano named Squeaks. And so unlike, the string instrument that ebbs into a minor chord, the voice requires breath. So the notes are sung, there's a pause, and then there is the respite, and then the ability to extend the chord again. And this is the score that you hear. In the installation, I created this system where we worked with, and I also want to say the score, the monotone symphony, was created by Cadet Kuhn, who's here today, and has done like much of my sound for the last 12 years, who I'm absolutely indebted to, and is the mastermind behind this. Like, I have this concept, and then they always make it so beautiful, and they also completely understand what I'm trying to get at, and then like level it up with their brilliance. So I just wanted to give you a shout out because you're here, and I'm so, happy that you're here to see how beautiful your work is. Yes. And so with Cadet's score, the lower resonant tones of that D major chord are, they become a formal device in that I hid these bass shakers in that pool of water. So you're seeing this perfect Rorschach in the projection. But then when those lower resonant tones are sung, all of a sudden, there's a shake in the water, and the actual, the Rorschach is ruptured, and you're forced to, again, see the image as it is, as opposed to an abstraction. The next piece I want to talk about is Movement 2, which is Half-Life. It features the same dancers that are reenacting movements from Human Measure amidst the dunes of White Sands National Park, New Mexico, which is, as so all of you are from here know, is situated very close to the White Sands Missile Range, the largest military installation in the nation, and very close to the Trinity test site where the first atomic bomb was detonated in 1945. There are days. And finally, the last movement. And we're going to talk about Movement 2 and 3 in depth in the questions, which is why I'm not going so into these movements. Movement 3 is Etched in Light. It's a performance in a documentary film, a large-scale cyanotype that is inspired by Human Measure, which was recorded on March 31st, 2024 on Trans Day of Visibility at the invitation of the National Center for Trans Equality. Etched in Light was made with over 100 trans and non-binary artists, with vocal invocations and musical scoring by Blood is Hero, which are the three vocalists, Carmina Escobar, Rocco Cordova, and Dorian Wood. These durational performances resulted in the live creation of one of the world's largest cyanotypes, which you will see downstairs if you are so interested. So just one quick note that I also wanted to make. When you watched the documentary of the making of from last March, you'll notice that many of the performers were wearing keffiyehs. That was not something that I asked, but I said if people wanted to, that they should. Because we were mounting this new work at the state capitol as folks in Gaza were being killed and struggling to survive in real time from state-sanctioned violence that is supported by the US and Canadian tax dollars. So I want to be clear that my team stands in solidarity with Palestinian people's right of life for peace and liberation and against imperialist state-sanctioned massacres. We stand collectively against Islamophobia, anti-Semitism around the world, and we call for justice everywhere that people are fighting to live and to heal and have their humanity honored amidst violent conditions. We fight for liberation, compassion, and for a world that insists upon both gentleness and justice. And I'm really also super honored that the producers from Etched in Light are here with us, Courtney Cook and Buffy Sierra, as well as Faria Zaman. They totally surprised me. I knew that Courtney was coming, but then all of a sudden she secretly orchestrated, and like Fariha and Buffy were like, oh, we're so sad we can't be there. And then there they were. I was like, you really pulled my leg. Anyways, so beautiful to be able to share. So often I have shows far away from those I make it with, so it's just been, and also one young person who was laying on the cyanotype, Caroline, right? Caroline Bell, who came out all the way from Michigan. They came to lie upon the cyanotype in DC and then came out here with their mom to see the exhibition. So it's just like, this is such a moving moment for me. So thank you for coming. Thanks for bringing your mom. Okay, so that's the end of my blah, blah, blah. And we will get on to the questions.
Okay, so thank you, Cassils. You've given us so much richness to work with. So I thought, I'd like us to revisit some of the issues that you brought up. And the first is the whole tension between representation and visibility on the one hand and invisibility and opacity on the other. That is a thread that I think runs through a lot of your work. So you gave us the notion of the trapdoor, right? Neither entrance nor exit, a path to an elsewhere, as you called it. And this is also what Black feminist scholars have called a loophole of retreat, right? Following from Harriet Jacobs' autobiography. So thinking about a space of both enclosure on the one hand and freedom on the other. And so, what I've been so consistently struck by in Cassils' work is the way in which Cassils consistently pushes against a kind of voyeuristic surveying gaze on trans bodies. And at the same time, you seem to offer up the trans body to that gaze in other moments. I think Human Measure is a really great example of that. And then also Tiresias, and I think we have some images from that. So, in your piece, Tiresias, which Cassils performed most recently last year in London, he melted a block of ice with his own body heat. And what was so striking to me in this performance is the way in which the light on the ice refracts, bends, and distorts Cassils' body, right? So that we as viewers are actually left with a blinding light that refuses and refutes the gaze on Cassils' naked body. And so the audience then is drawn into a kind of affective relay between Cassils and us, the viewer. And we witness the stoicism of Cassils' body, but also his body coming undone. And so as the performance continues for hours, you see Cassils' body trembling, reddening, tears coming down his face, right? And so you're faced also with the extreme vulnerability of the trans body. So the trans body here is both encased in an armature of ice, of musculature, but is also coming undone. And so to my mind, this piece, and really much of your work, conjures up what the Caribbean philosopher Edouard Glissant has called for, which is the right to opacity, right? And he talks about the right to opacity, particularly for minoritarian subjects who are typically, the subject of the surveilling, scrutinizing, regulatory gaze, right? And so I think Cassils' work really insists on opacity, on the unknowability of the trans body, even as he works within the traps of representation and visibility. So I'd love to just open up space to have you, Cassils, reflect a bit more on that play between opacity and visibility in this current work. You talk about, at one point in your introduction, you talked about mobilizing abstraction by showing the outlines of the body, the traces of the body, rather than the body itself. So maybe we can enter into that conversation.
Okay. Thank you. You know, and one thing I love about Glissant and his analysis of opacity is this concept that it's against horizontalization, it's against flattening, and it's not saying that we're all the same. It's saying actually we're very different, and it's very hard to read each other. So he insists upon this idea of the tangle and the weave as a strategy, which I think is incredibly important and valuable right now. You know, for example, just like as I was thinking about creating Etched in Light at the behest of the National Center for Trans Equity, you know, they were trying to do is mobilize the trans vote. You know, we have the Latino vote, the Black vote, the women's vote. What about the trans vote? And so this was a sort of mediagenic spectacle that in the beginning was really about trying to draw attention to this idea of voting and to lift up the National Center for Trans Equity, which is an important organization that does important things. But, you know, as this political campaign has unfolded and as we had seen, like, Democrats turning their back on those in Gaza, it's like, I don't really want to vote for either of these motherfuckers, you know? But at the same time, voting is very, very important. And so we kept the word to do that work alongside them to lift up voting. But rather than simply just uplifting, as I had done in a work like In Plain Sight, for example, which was where myself and artist Rafael Esparza worked with 80 different artists and 17 immigrant justice orgs to mobilize like sky typing flights to type images over detention centers such that people knew where these detention centers were. You know, that was a very didactic work to like call upon people's attention. And I believed in that cause, but voting, I was like, of course I believe in voting, but I didn't believe in this election. And so I was thinking about how Etched in Light could actually provide the sort of experience of connection and like other ways of doing things, like as we develop those cyanotypes on this like hollowed ground of the Washington Mall, and then ran screaming towards the Capitol building, holding them over our heads like giant banners. Like, it's like, and what else? So yes, and what else can art do when our systems fail us? And then I guess like likewise, thinking about those tactics of refusal is, you know, something that I entered into early on in like 2012 in a piece like Becoming an Image, which I do think I have some images of. Yeah, whereas like this work I started in 2012, but it's a work that I'm actually in training for because I'm going to perform it in January. It's like the one iterative piece that I do over and over again. And I do that because as I look through the images from 2012 to now, I can see my body aging. Wow. I can see my body aging. So I feel like this is a life work, but it's a 2,000-pound clay monolith that I beat the living crap out of in pitch darkness. And the performance is only made visible by the act of it being photographed. So this is like Human Measure's impetus. It came from this work. Human Measure is really like Becoming an Image on steroids. And so this work, you know, that you are seeing here visibly rendered in photographs is actually like maybe 99.8 of it isn't actually seen. It all takes place in the dark. You smell me, you hear me, you feel maybe a fleck of clay land on your body, but you yourself do not really see much except for these ephemeral traces. So rather than the document simply being, you know, something that I'm thinking about as a sort of way of capturing, I'm actually knowing that you can't capture a performance. Impossible. It's like taking a photograph of a sunset. How do you capture truths and the lives? Like Becoming an Image was eventually created for an archive, a trans archive at the University of Southern California. And it's like, I can't possibly represent all that's missing. So instead I made a work around missing, around absence. And so I really think about that in terms of this idea of opacity, that it's like, it's just part of I feel I try to build it into the work itself, that sort of failure as being inevitable in certain ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. You know, you mentioned aging, right? And your changing body. And, you know, I was talking earlier about vulnerability in relation to Tiresias. And I'm just sort of struck by that, the way in which, you know, your work conjures up both, you know, I mean, like I said, the kind of extreme musculature of your body, but also it's unraveling. And this piece does that too in some ways, right? Like you're exhausted at the end of it. And you had mentioned the Eve Klein, the kind of triumphalism sort of descending into failure. And I'm thinking of Jack Halberstam's work on the queer art of failure, right? And so in some ways it seems like, you know, you're like this Ubermensch, right? But then you're not. There's like extreme vulnerability in all of your performances as well. I don't know if you want to say a few words about that.
I think it kind of speaks to the need, back to those ideas of the way that we're undulating, you know, between these multiple positions at once. It's like I grew up very sick. I with undiagnosed disease. I was told was psychosomatic. Like much of my my own pathway to strength and empowerment comes from being diminished, being told that everything was in my head, being told that like my truth wasn't true. And so to compensate in many ways, I've become hyper strong, hyper aware, right? And so I believe that, you know, it's another manifestation of like holding that sort of preparedness and that strength and that fortitude that comes from a space of having been dismissed. So in many ways, it isn't actually a contradiction. It is a very like understandable manifestation of a journey coming from a place of constantly being undermined.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, let's talk more about movement itself, you know, this piece that's now on view. And I'm just so struck by how you're playing with both time and space in the piece, in all three of the pieces, right? So I wanted to ask you, what is important for you in conjuring up this massive timescale that is far beyond human life cycles, you know? So you're gesturing to the kind of ancientness of this land, the specificity of White Sands as a location, obviously as, you know, this kind of violent space of the atomic bomb tests, but also these much older histories that sort of far exceed that, even as the traces of the atomic bomb continue to live in the present, right? And then you're placing trans bodies in this landscape, you know, this massive landscape. So can you sort of reflect on what you're doing with this kind of longue durée and placing trans bodies within that, and the specificity of White Sands in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the impetuses in this work, as someone who's like known as a trans artist, was to just push back on the sort of really like pablum-y, watered down ways in which we think of trans identity. And so I was really thinking of different sorts of analytic spaces and tools and also emotional states in which to think about our subjectivity. So maybe Human Measure, like the movement one, the dance piece, is about mediation and the role of photography and technology in the regulation of our bodies. And then Etched in Light DC is really about, you know, the legislation of the government in this real time of space, this particular political moment. But then, you know, like right before the night before the election, I took my master's students to visit Martha Wilson at the Franklin Furnace, which is the largest performance art repository and archive in North America. And she gave my students a 50-slide presentation because they've been open for 50 years, 1 year for every slide. And basically what she showed us was, you know, the incredible arc of art that has constantly been in relationship to forces of oppression over time. And so my young students were like nail biting. I was like, yeah, this is now, but what about a larger scope? And so just like in terms of timelines, I wanted to make White Sands as a site because it is such an incredible, and it's a site that is so, it just like speaks to its ancientness, and I'll get into that for a second. But for context, I just first, I want to talk about it as a militarized site. I want to talk about the military base, and for context, I just want to show 2 videos. So bear with me here. So the first is Truman. This is President Truman and his announcement of the dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima. There you go.
We are now prepared to destroy more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, and their communications. Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war. It was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July the 26th was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Behind this air attack will follow sea and land forces in such numbers and power as they have not yet seen, and with the fighting skill of which they are already well aware.
Okay.
Israel's unflinching and ongoing televised genocide in Gaza and now Lebanon in defense of a colonial occupation and an apartheid state. Like every state that has carried out ethnic cleansing and genocide in history, Zionists in Israel, who believe themselves to be the chosen people, began by dehumanizing Palestinians before driving them off their land and murdering them. Prime Minister Menachem Begin called Palestinians two-legged beasts. Yitzhak Rabin called them grasshoppers who could be crushed. And Golda Meir said there was no such thing as Palestinians. Once those two-legged beasts, grasshoppers, dogs, and non-existent people were murdered, ethnically cleansed and ghettoized, a new country was born, no matter what crimes it committed. It grew up like a protected child in a wealthy home whose parents smile proudly as it commits atrocity upon atrocity. No wonder today it feels free to boast openly about committing genocide. No wonder Israeli soldiers seem to have lost all sense of decency. No wonder they flood the social media with depraved videos. Who are these people? What can possibly justify what Israel is doing? This is the part where I'm meant to lapse into moral equivalence and condemn Hamas and to condemn the people of Gaza who celebrated the Hamas attack. I do not tell oppressed people how to resist their oppression or who their allies should be. The point is to ask ourselves whether a liberal, secular fighting force can go up against a genocidal war machine. Because when all the powers of the world are arrayed against them, who do they have to turn to but God? I'm aware that Hezbollah and the Iranian regime have vocal detractors in their own countries, some who also languish in jails or who have faced far worse outcomes. I'm aware that some of their actions constitute war crimes. However, there cannot be an equivalence between this and what Israel and the United States are doing in Gaza, in the West Bank, and now in Lebanon. I ask you, which of us sitting in this hall would willingly submit to the indignity that Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank have been subjected to for decades? What peaceful means have the Palestinian people not tried? What compromise have they not accepted, other than the one that requires them to crawl on their knees and eat dirt? Israel is not fighting a war of self-defense. It is fighting a war to occupy more territory, to strengthen its apartheid apparatus, and tighten its control on Palestinian people and the region. When Benjamin Netanyahu holds up a map of the Middle East in which Palestine has been erased and Israel stretches from the river to the sea, he is applauded as a visionary who's working to realize the dream of a Jewish homeland. But when Palestinians and their supporters chant, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," they are accused of explicitly calling for the genocide of Jews. Are they really? Or is that a sick imagination projecting its own darkness onto others? An imagination that cannot countenance diversity, cannot countenance the idea of living in a country alongside other people, equally with equal rights.
So I just wanted to show you those two for context. And that was just, I just want to say that was Arundhati Roy. And this is her acceptance speech for the Penn Pinter Prize ceremony in London earlier this month. And I showcase these two speeches just to speak to the fact that White Sands is anything but a blank canvas. And I show you these two speeches that exemplify a history of US militarization and imperialism in a direct way that the landscape does not. And then there's a much longer history that I'm also evoking, and that is the evaporation of the park's water tables due to climate disaster has revealed fossilized human footprints that date back over 23,000 years. So when we do a sort of carbon dating of the tiny seeds that are found in these footprints, 23,000 years, that's 10,000 years earlier than we initially thought that human beings were here present. And those footprints and tracks are the oldest forensic evidence of human beings in the America. And this really confirms indigenous knowledge that these minerals remember, that the land perpetually rewrites itself in the longest act of memory. 23,000 is also the half-life of plutonium. It is a much larger timeline in this moment and situates us in the center between first contact and the remnants of our destructive behaviors. And so really me situating trans dancers in this landscape of White Sands unearths these complexities of history of land and places of population, prompting viewers to think about thinking about like how land is legislated, how bodies are legislated, and specifically how some are protected while others are sacrificed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we started a little bit late. It's 3:00 now, so I think we'll go to about 3:10. So if you can stay, that would be wonderful. So Cassils' movement is in some ways a kind of departure from your earlier work, even though, as you said, it's sort of drawing on very clearly on human measure. So your earlier work, like Tiresias, like Inextinguishable Fire, Becoming an Image, the focus was really on your body, right? Its strength, its vulnerability, as we spoke about. But movement is different. It's very much about foregrounding collectivity. It's your body among other bodies. It's about the collective body. It's about collective breath. And I'm so struck by the way the sound works in both of these pieces, really. You really get the viscerality of the live performance through the soundtrack. So, and similarly, earlier work like Pissed, or as you mentioned, In Plain Sight, were really quite explicitly didactic. In some ways, they were reactive to a particular political moment. And this piece, Movement, seems to be different. It has a different tenor. It has a different feel to it. So I'm wondering if you can speak about that, the way in which this does constitute a little bit of a shift in your work to thinking more about collectivity rather than the focus on your body as a stand-in for the collective. And also the way in which it's not explicitly political in the way that some of your other work is.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think, I believe we make different art in different moments. And I felt really called to make something like In Plain Sight with Rafa. I actually just texted him the other night saying, I think it's time to get the band back together. He hasn't written back yet. But I think there are moments where art can really play a direct and didactic role. And so something like In Plain Sight was an example of that. I actually have a few images I can show. This is Pissed, but I'm trying to get to In Plain Sight. Yeah, so for example, this is GeoGroup's headquarters, which is one of the companies that is like the largest funders of for-profit prison incarceration in the United States. And I wrote my message. There were 80 artists who left 15 character messages. I wrote DEFA, I wrote shame, because I found out that Canadian tax dollars, our pension plans, our national pension plans for every elder in Canada was heavily invested in GeoGroup, right? So these like really crazy sorts of entanglements that happen that even citizens aren't even aware of, right? And so this was a piece that was made really during the height of COVID. This is Bambi Salcedo, the head of the Trans-Latina Coalition, Stop Cremation Now, over a field office. Patrice Cullors, the co-founder of Black Lives Matter, her message, Care Not Cages, Suru for Solidarity, Karen Ishizuka, who wrote No More Camps. She's a descendant of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during Pearl Harbor. So at the Santa Anita racetrack, you can see it was turned into an internment camp in 1945. This is the racetrack now. And she brought together these elders and sky-typed No More Camps. So there are moments where this didactic is necessary in shifting the consciousness, and I believe that art is really like a way to break through the kind of white noise of political kind of back and forth, especially now, and how can we use poetics to like be a monkey wrench into the subconscious. But after this piece, I was just, the whole thing happened on Zoom, like I've never used my body less in my entire life. And I really selfishly actually just wanted to make something with bodies, with people. And also as I'm getting older now, like I'm thinking about younger generations, and I'm thinking about how, in the art world, there's no one for me to look to ask for mentorship. Like the closest I can see is maybe Catherine Opie, but there's no like trans-masculine, successful contemporary artists that are like gained recognition. There are very important ones that are under-recognized, like Della Grace Volcano, but as I get older, I think like, what would it be like for me to be that person for younger artists and dancers? And I certainly had that relationship with these young folks that I got to work with. And so for me, it's about kind of modeling what it is to just allow young artists to come into themselves and try to give them that freedom and that sort of agency in a way that I did not have. And furthermore, it's also a sort of insistence that beyond just didactic messaging, we need to have our imaginations. We need to be able to stretch. We need to be able to be weird and wacky and unintelligible. Like so much pressure is put on us to be legible and explain ourselves. And so really like these works were a sort of subconscious fever dream that just kind of kept haunting me. And when I was younger, I would like kind of rake myself over like the coals, the sort of like experience that I had of the sort of pedagogical experience of critique. I was a student of Michael Asher's. We would have 15-hour critiques, y'all. Okay, so I could really think of a million reasons not to make something versus to make it. But now I'm trusting that it's in me, and that I have a right to make. And so I've been trying to like, I feel like this show is really that. It's me giving myself permission to sort of follow a different sort of vision and a different kind of calling. And not to say that's the only direction I'll go in, but it was a place I needed to stretch. And even in this urgent moment, I think we need multiplicities of strategies. We need those didactic calls to action, but we also need these places to express and feel like pleasure and joy and weirdness and radical experimentation, and just to not know what we're doing in a way that feels like not even productive, that just feels like free. We need free. We need to be able to feel free.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. I actually think that's a lovely place for us to end, but I was wondering, maybe we'll take, it's 3:05, so maybe we'll take maybe 2 questions from the audience, if we can bring the lights up. It'd be lovely to hear from you all.
Thank you so much, Cassils and Gayatri, for this beautiful offering. I feel like I'm going to be coming away with so much to be with. And one question I have, which might unfurl into a few, is about your relationship with clay. And I want to contextualize this question as someone who is, an aging, chronically ill trans ceramic artist. And watching the images of you with the clay, I was like, how did Cassils decide which clay body to use? Like, what are the earth elements in that clay body?
Yes.
What relationship have you built with that clay over a decade of doing this iterative performance? And when I think of clay, something I love about it is that it reminds me what time does to a body, in that you can speed up or slow down geological time. And for me, it's really helped as a trap door to other timelines and timescales beyond the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene, or however we might want to language this era of crisis in which we find ourselves. So anyway, I just offer that up for consideration, and thank you so much.
Well, what a beautiful and thoughtful question. Thank you. I think I initially hadn't really even thought of clay. My impetus when I first made this work was I was invited to perform it at USC at the One Archives. And it was, to be honest, I was given like 3 weeks to put this whole concept together. And so it was kind of like, just kind of acting. And I hadn't even thought of the sculptural aspect, the ceramic aspect, the clay aspect. For me, at that point, it was more about the live photograph and the retinal burn. And that's what I was like, that was driving me conceptually. And it was only after the fact that I looked at this mound of clay and I was like, oh, this means something. But to find the clay itself, I was coming at it more from, I guess, the perspective of an athletic mindset, meaning thinking like, okay, if my body is this instrument and I'm going to try to unleash my maximum power for as long as I can, what material will not break my bones, will not rupture my tendons? Like, what is the mix that will allow me that collision that allows for like an indexical, or what Amelia Jones would call a material trace, but that also doesn't totally break my hand, for example. And so I went to the Laguna Clay Company because I had been living in Southern California, and I told these clay bros what I was wanting to do, and they brought down like 8 bricks, and I was like Goldilocks, just like punching them all. And I found this one, and I was like, oh, this feels just right. And like when I found out what it was, it's called WED2E17, and it, like serendipitously, is the clay that was developed by Walter Edward Disney to make stop motion animation. So when we're thinking about sort of trans identity as an unforeclosed and constantly mutable form as a concept, it was just like a really happy accident to find this clay. And I also was interested in its like, it wasn't like, clay has like so many colors that connote, obviously have like racial connotations. So like it's kind of the grayness of it. It made me think of like the sort of many creation myths that start with clay, and just thinking of a clay as a sort of creation myth. And this piece that I continue to perform and started when I, in 2012, when I was like, not long after my boxing, I'd still been working as a personal trainer. I was extremely fit. And as I continue to age, like my life of athleticism is haunting me. I have injuries, like I have, and I still, it's like, okay, so I can't use that leg in this performance. I guess I'll do it without that leg. And so rather than trying to constantly like meet the place that I was before, I allow my process to engage with that clay, and for that clay to also index not just like the shape of violence in an attack, but also the amount of force that I'm able to exert on it over time, as exemplified by where my aging trans body is at, as I move through my own injuries and my own sort of relations. So that doesn't completely answer everything, but it gets a little bit there. Thank you for that.
Okay, well, thank you all so much, and thank you, Cassils, for this work.
Thank you, Gayatri.